A fog settles over the forgotten hollow of Odd, West Virginia, a place where the roads turn to mud and memory, and the air itself feels heavy with old secrets. The houses here don't just lean, they sigh. Porches creak under the weight of years, and dogs bark at nothing, as if warning of things the rest of us can't see. If you've been with us before, you know this place. You've seen the faces that made the Whitaker name echo through Appalachia: Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, Freddie, and those long, silent stares that said more than words ever could. Their story wasn't just about inbreeding or isolation, it was about survival in the dark corners of America, where the light rarely reaches. But tonight, we go deeper. Back before the YouTube cameras and whispered documentaries, back to the woman who quietly held the family together, Betty Whittaker, the matriarch in the shadows. They called her simple, sometimes strange, yet in the Whitaker home, Betty was the one constant, the caretaker, the voice that soothed the madness, the heart that refused to stop beating even when the rest of the world turned away. Neighbors said she never left the hollow, but maybe she didn't have to, because everything she loved and everything that broke her was right there inside it. The fog rolls thicker as we walk that dirt road again, the same one where Mark Laita first parked his car and heard the dogs bark from deep in the yard. The air feels the same, but the story has changed. What once felt like a curiosity now feels like a wound. Because when Betty died, a chapter of Appalachian history closed, one written not in ink, but in silence, struggle, and blood. What happens to a family when the outside world finally looks in? What do we owe to the people we call different? Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Somewhere far from these mountains, or close enough to feel their weight? If stories like this one move you, stories buried in the forgotten corners of America, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because this is Underbelly Bloodline, and every family leaves a mark. Some fade into history, and others are never allowed to. Deep in the hollows of Raleigh County, the Whitaker name stretches back farther than most can remember. Long before YouTube cameras and curious reporters found their way down that dirt road, there was a time when the family still went to church on Sundays, still tried to keep their place in a world that had already forgotten them. It began, as these stories often do, with isolation, a family pushed to the edge of the map and then left there to survive on their own. Roads washed out, jobs vanished, and neighbors drifted away. By the time the world moved on, the Whitakers were already rooted too deep in the soil of Odd, West Virginia to leave. Their history isn't written in books, it's whispered in graveyards and carried in the slant of old headstones. Poverty turned into pride. Pride turned into silence. And silence became the curse that bound them together. Generations grew up believing the outside world was dangerous, that family was the only thing that could be trusted, even when that trust blurred the bloodline itself. You can almost see it, a single cabin light flickering against the trees, children playing in the yard, unaware that the rest of the world would one day call them the most inbred family in America. But back then, they weren't a spectacle. They were just surviving. Betty Whittaker grew up hearing stories about her parents and their parents before them, people who worked the mines, trapped game, and lived by their own rules. She inherited not just their blue eyes and quiet ways, but their pain too. Every generation carried a little more of it, the hunger, the confusion, the shame passed down like a family heirloom. There were whispers of feuds, of fights that split brothers apart, of children born into cycles no one dared to name. And by the time outsiders began to ask questions, the Whitakers had already forgotten where their story began, or maybe they just didn't want to remember. The tragedy of the Whitaker family isn't just in their blood, it's in what America allowed to happen when the poor were left behind, unseen and unheard. So tonight, as we trace the roots of this Appalachian legacy, I want to ask you, do you believe people become what they're born into, or can they ever break free from it? If you're drawn to stories like this, where the truth lies buried beneath years of silence and sorrow, subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline, because this story isn't over, it's only getting darker. The sun barely touches the hollow before it disappears again behind the ridge, and in that soft, dim light, Betty Whittaker moves like a ghost through her own yard. The screen door creaks open, dogs bark from every corner, and the smell of earth and wood smoke clings to the air. This was Betty's kingdom, a patch of Appalachian soil where time had long ago stopped keeping count. Long before the cameras found her family, Betty was already a legend in odd West Virginia. Not for beauty or wealth, but for her quiet endurance. While the world outside changed paved roads, neon signs, a generation chasing something better, Betty stayed behind, tending to what was left. She cared for her brothers, for the children who could no longer speak right, for the family that never seemed to grow beyond that single road. In the flicker of an oil lamp, you can imagine her face weathered, lined, but steady. Neighbors said she could calm even the most violent storms that passed through that house. When voices rose, when tempers flared, Betty's voice would settle the room like a prayer, half whispered and half forgotten. She wasn't educated, but she carried wisdom born of hard winters and harder choices. Behind her calmness, though, was exhaustion, a lifetime of holding together what the world refused to understand. The Whitakers were mocked, gawked at, filmed, and dissected. But through all of it, Betty remained a guardian, standing between her family and a cruel, curious world. She didn't ask for pity or fame, only peace. The outsiders saw confusion, but Betty saw family. They saw inbreeding. She saw survival. Every generation before her had been trapped by geography, poverty, and silence, and Betty inherited that burden like a crown of thorns, the kind you don't wear for glory, but out of duty. In those final years, she rarely spoke of the past. Maybe she knew too much pain to tell it right, or maybe she understood what we all forget, that some stories aren't meant to be explained, only felt. The hollow is quieter now, the porch empty. The dogs still bark at the same ghosts, but her presence lingers in the wind through the trees, in the sorrow that never quite left those hills. So let me ask you, do you think Betty was protecting her family from the world, or protecting the world from her family? If you've been following this story, if you believe in uncovering the forgotten bloodlines of America, make sure you keep watching and share this video, because the deeper we go, the darker it gets. And Betty's shadow is only the beginning. The road into odd West Virginia is the kind that feels like it wasn't meant to be found. It twists through the mountains like a scar, narrow, washed out, and lined with trees that seem to lean in, as if listening. For decades, that road led to nowhere, until the day the visitors came. It was a warm summer afternoon when the quiet was broken by the sound of a car engine climbing the hill, unfamiliar, foreign. The dogs were the first to notice, barking wildly as the dust kicked up behind the wheels. And in that moment, the Whitaker world sealed off for generations collided with the outside. Out stepped men with cameras, recorders, and questions outsiders, carrying the weight of curiosity disguised as compassion. To the Whitakers, they were strangers with strange intentions. To the visitors, this was a chance to document what most Americans could never imagine. A family so isolated that language itself had begun to fade. Betty Whittaker stood back on the porch that day, her face unreadable. She had seen enough of life to know that being noticed didn't always mean being understood. Behind her, the family gathered in confusion, Ray barking, Lorraine pacing, the old hounds circling the yard. The visitors whispered to one another, capturing footage that would soon travel around the world. The hollow had always been a mirror of what Appalachia hides: poverty, mental illness, and a generational loop that no one dared to break. The visitors brought exposure, but also exploitation. Their lenses saw the strangeness before they saw the suffering. What they called curiosity felt like intrusion. What they filmed as truth felt, to the Whitakers, like another kind of violence. Still, that moment changed everything. The world that had forgotten the Whitakers now couldn't look away. Millions would watch in fascination, but few would ever ask why this family ended up trapped in that hollow to begin with. The truth was more complex than inbreeding or isolation. It was about abandonment, a community that left its weakest behind, a system that turned poverty into spectacle. And through it all, Betty remained silent, watching, enduring. The matriarch who never asked for pity, only privacy. So I'll ask you, if the world came knocking on your door, not to help but to stare, would you let them in? The Whitaker home sits at the end of a winding dirt road, a structure that looks less like it was built and more like it grew from the earth itself. Its walls lean, its boards grown, and its roof seems to bow under the weight of memory. In the Appalachian dusk, the house doesn't just stand, it breathes. You can feel it when the wind moves through its broken windows, a low, hollow sigh, like something alive remembering what it's lost. Inside, the air is thick, the smell of wood smoke, old fabric, and dogs that have never known silence. There are no family portraits on the walls, no photographs framed in pride, only peeling paint, sagging wallpaper, and echoes of footsteps, whispers, and laughter that once filled these rooms when the Whitakers were still young enough to believe the world outside might change. Betty Whittaker called this place home her entire life. Here, she tended to her brothers, fed the dogs, and tried to keep order in a house that had long surrendered to chaos. Every corner tells a story: the worn couch where she sat beside Ray, the stove where she cooked beans and cornbread when there wasn't much else. The walls themselves feel like they've absorbed every sound, every cry, every prayer that went unanswered. To outsiders, this house became a symbol, a visual shorthand for inbreeding, poverty, and decay. But to Betty, it was sacred ground, a place where her people lived, suffered, and endured. She knew its rhythm, its sighs, its soft creaks in the night. To her, those sounds weren't frightening. They were familiar, the heartbeat of a family that refused to disappear. Yet the house held darker things too, secrets whispered between generations, arguments that turned into silence, abuse that went unspoken but not unfelt. Poverty has a way of turning walls into prisons, and the Whitaker home was both a refuge and a cell. It protected them from the world and trapped them inside their own legacy. Now, when the cameras return, the house still stands, but empty. The dogs bark to no one. The doors swing open with the wind. What remains are the echoes of Betty's voice, of Ray's howls, of a lineage that time couldn't quite erase. Maybe the real haunting isn't in the ghosts of the dead, but in the lives that were never fully lived. So tell me, if walls could speak, would you want to hear what they remember? If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, the ones America tried to bury in silence, make sure you subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline. Because this isn't just a story about a house, it's about everything that was lost inside it. The town of Odd, West Virginia, isn't on most maps. It's the kind of place you pass, without realizing you've been there. A handful of houses, a church, a store that's been closed for decades. Life here moves slow, steady, and silent. And sometimes, silence is its own form of guilt. For years, the people of Odd knew about the Whitakers. They saw the family walking the back roads, heard the barking dogs echoing through the valley, and whispered stories in hushed tones at the diner or the gas station. Some pitied them, some mocked them, but most just looked away. Because in Appalachia, looking away is easier than looking too close. They said the Whitakers were different. They said it like a warning, a superstition, as if their misfortune might spread if spoken aloud. Teachers remembered the children who came to school without shoes. Neighbors recalled the nights when screaming carried through the trees. But in a town where everyone had their own ghosts to hide poverty, addiction, old family feuds, the Whitakers became a mirror no one wanted to face. Betty Whittaker lived among them all those years, unseen and unspoken about. She'd buy groceries with what little she had, maybe exchange a word or two at the counter, then vanish back up that dirt road. And the town let her, because acknowledging her meant acknowledging their own neglect. It wasn't just inbreeding that shaped the Whitakers. It was abandonment, a slow erasure written by generations who chose silence over help. When the outsiders finally arrived with cameras, Odd turned its gaze again, this time not in ignorance, but in shame. The same people who once avoided the Whitakers now couldn't stop watching them on screens. And that's the cruel irony of it all. The world that refused to see them when they needed compassion now stared when it was too late to offer anything but curiosity. Somewhere in that silence lies a truth about us all. We don't need to be cruel to destroy someone, we just need to do nothing. So I'll ask you, in your town, in your life, who are the people everyone chooses not to see? If you believe stories like this matter, the ones buried beneath America's polite silence, because this is where we look straight into the places the world turns away from, and we don't blink. In the shadowed folds of Appalachia, blood remembers what the mind tries to forget. Every scar, every silence, Every act of cruelty buried in the family line, it doesn't fade, it lingers. And in the Whitaker family, pain wasn't just something they endured, it became something they inherited. Long before Betty Whittaker was born, the hills around Odd, West Virginia, had already written the first chapters of their story. The mines had closed, the fields turned to weeds, and the people who stayed behind did so because there was nowhere else to go. Families grew inward instead of outward, generation after generation tied by blood, bound by necessity. By the time Betty came of age, her family's world had shrunk to a single hollow. Abuse, neglect, and mental decline had woven themselves into the everyday rhythm of life. Fathers vanished, mothers worked themselves to exhaustion, children grew up without ever knowing the warmth of something better. Poverty hardened into habit, and habit turned into heritage. The Whitakers didn't just carry a bloodline, they carried a curse of silence. There were stories that never made it past their front porch, of tempers that turned violent, of children left hungry, of moments when shame replaced love. Inbreeding was only the surface of a much deeper wound, one cut open by centuries of isolation, pride, and survival. Betty, more than anyone, bore the weight of it. She became the mother to the broken, the caretaker to the forgotten. She tried to hold together what generations before her had already let fall apart. But no matter how tightly she clung, the ghosts of the past were always there, whispering through the walls, reminding her that pain doesn't end when a person dies. It echoes. When outsiders finally came, they saw the symptoms, the strange faces, the confused words, the chaos. What they couldn't see was the inheritance of suffering trauma passed down like an heirloom no one asked for. What happens to a family when generations of hurt are never healed? They begin to live it over and over again. This is what generational trauma looks like when it has a face, a name, a hollow to haunt. So tell me, do you believe pain can be passed down through blood, the same way a family passes down its name? If you've been following this story, if you believe in uncovering the truth buried in America's forgotten bloodlines, because the deeper we trace the Whitakers' pain, the closer we come to understanding what we were never meant to see. The hollow had always been quiet, the kind of quiet that hums beneath the wind, filled with the sound of dogs barking and rusted tin roofs rattling under the weight of years. For generations, the Whitakers had lived in that silence, tucked away from the world, unseen and unbothered. But one day, the quiet broke. A car engine echoed through the valley, unfamiliar, modern, out of place. The dogs went wild. The family froze. When the visitors stepped out with cameras in their hands, it was as if time itself stopped in Odd, West Virginia. What began as curiosity would soon become something far bigger, a window into America's forgotten underbelly, and a mirror held up to its cruelty. The world first met the Whitakers through the lens of Whitaker, the creator behind Soft White Underbelly. His intention wasn't to mock, but to document. Yet, once those images hit the internet, something irreversible happened. Millions of people stared into the faces of a family shaped by generations of isolation. And they didn't see people, they saw a spectacle. Betty Whittaker stood in the background that day, watching the cameras turn her family into content. She'd lived her whole life trying to protect them from the outside world, and now that world was pouring in through phone screens and comment sections. For the first time, their names were trending. But fame, for the Whitakers, wasn't a blessing. It was exposure, raw, unfiltered, and merciless. People called them monsters, called them freaks, turned their pain into memes. But beneath the noise, a quieter truth lingered. The Whitakers never asked for attention. They didn't understand the language of online sympathy or exploitation. What they understood was loyalty, and the unspoken rule that family was family, no matter how broken. For a moment, the world felt empathy. Donations came, awareness spread, but as quickly as it began, the attention shifted elsewhere, leaving behind the same hollow, the same dirt road, the same house where nothing had changed. The cameras came and went, but the Whitakers remained trapped in the same cycle, their suffering immortalized, their humanity blurred. When the cameras came, the world saw them for the first time. But the tragedy is, they were never truly seen. So I'll ask you, do you think showing someone's truth helps them, or just feeds our hunger to feel superior. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told with empathy, not exploitation, make sure you share this video. The morning Betty Whittaker passed. The hollow was unnaturally still, not the kind of quiet that comes with peace, but the kind that sits heavy, as though the hills themselves were holding their breath. A fog drifted low over the dirt road leading to the Whitaker home, the same road she had walked her entire life. In that dim light, her story, one built from generations of struggle, silence, and survival, came to its final chapter. Betty had always been the heart of the Whitaker family. To outsiders, she was a mystery, a woman of few words, a steady presence in the chaos of poverty and whispers. But to those who truly knew her, she was a protector. She fed whoever showed up at her door, kept the lights on when the world forgot them, and carried the shame of a bloodline she didn't create but couldn't escape. In her last years, the cameras had turned her family's isolation into a spectacle. Betty endured it quietly, understanding that pity was just another form of attention, and attention, for the Whitakers, had always come with pain. She had seen it before. The world loves to look at tragedy, but never stays long enough to help it heal. The official story of her death was simple. She died at home, surrounded by family, but in the hollow, folks spoke in whispers. Some said she'd grown tired, others said her heart gave out under the weight of years. Truth is, maybe it wasn't one moment that ended Betty's life, but the accumulation of 1,000 small heartbreaks, generations of suffering carried in silence until her body could carry no more. When word spread that Betty was gone, the internet mourned briefly. Comments flooded in, tributes poured out, and for a few days, the Whitakers were remembered again. But just like before, the attention faded. What remained was the same decaying house, the same broken chairs on the porch, and the same dogs barking into the endless hollow. Only now, the matriarch who held it all together and was gone. Her death wasn't just an ending, it was a passing of silence, a reminder that the deepest pain isn't found in violence, but in being forgotten. So tonight, as you sit there watching, tell me, do you think some stories are too painful to tell, or too important to stay buried? The fog rolls through odd West Virginia, once more thick, pale, and patient. It curls around the rusted mailboxes and the hollowed-out homes like memory itself refusing to let go. Time has thinned here, worn down by loss and repetition. The Whitaker name still lingers in the air, like smoke that won't clear, a reminder of what happens when generations are born into silence and survive only by instinct. Inside the weather-beaten house, the echoes remain. The walls still creak with the weight of all they've witnessed, the laughter that turned to murmurs, the prayers whispered for a mercy that never came. Betty is gone now, and yet her presence feels heavier than ever. Her chair by the window, her faded blanket, her shadow in family photographs, they all stand like relics of a legacy too complex to fully mourn. Those who remain the last of the Whitaker bloodline live between two worlds. They've become symbols to outsiders, the most inbred family in America, a cruel title that overlooks the truth of generational trauma, of systemic neglect, of a region forgotten by progress and compassion alike. Their story isn't just about bloodlines. It's about survival in a place where hope is a stranger and love is often mistaken for endurance. As the years pass, the cameras leave, the headlines fade, and what's left are the reflections, those moments when the hollow turns quiet and you can almost hear Betty's voice calling from the porch, telling her kin to come inside before dark. The world moves on, but the scars remain carved into the Appalachian soil, stitched into the veins of those who still bear the Whitaker name. The hollow teaches us something haunting. Bloodlines don't just define us, they bind us. And for families like the Whitakers, that bond is both their curse and their story's heartbeat. So, as you sit there, maybe in a city far from these mountains, I want to ask you, what stories run through your bloodline? What truths do families hide to keep the peace? If you believe every forgotten name deserves to be remembered, every silence deserves a voice, then join us. Subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline, where the echoes of Appalachia still speak, and the past never truly dies.